Welcome to the SFT Podcast. My guest today needs no introduction, but I will introduce you. Chris van Tulleken, thank you so much for joining me.
It's such a pleasure, Patrick.
Well, we've met a couple of times. I'm a massive fan of yours, and I feel that no one has done more to bring the issues around food and particularly ultra processing of food through your brilliant book, Ultra Processed People, than you. So I'd like to start by thanking you for building a bridge of understanding between the public and the story behind their food. So this is a very important discussion for me to have with you because I felt a great admiration for you, but also I wanted to explore whether you see extending your communication bridge beyond the farm gate, if I can put it that way, because I feel that you've built the bridge after the food leaves the farm gate, but then I think we need to go back further, if you see what I mean. What do you think about all that?
Two things. I reject your assertion that I have sort of changed people's minds. In a sense, until fairly recently, I have felt that the entire project of my contribution to changing anything has been a gigantic failure. I may be feeling, partly through conversations with you and people like you, I'm feeling like there is a sense of change. I absolutely agree. My opinion on ultra processed food is that the product level discussion is only important and interesting because it's about describing an ultra processed food system. And the only way we will see, I believe, the changes on the other side of that farm gate, on your side of the farm gate, is if there is a change in consumer demand. And so I feel like my voice is best deployed changing public opinion around the products, changing regulation of the products in all kinds of different ways. And that, I hope, will have a pull effect because I strongly believe if you buy, I think we have data, if you buy a piece of meat at the butcher's, you consider that meat in a very, very different way to when you buy a slice of the same kind of meat between two slices of ultra processed bread in a meal deal sandwich for your lunch break or in a pre-prepared lasagna. I think you and I mean, I know we want to see the same kind of changes in the food system, and my ambition is much more about ultra processed food is where health and environment really should come together. But I think we haven't made that case well enough, which is why it's fun to speak to you today.
Yeah, well, I completely agree with what you've just said. And in my opinion, I think you're going to agree with this as well. Only by harnessing the power of informed public opinion will we be able to transform our food systems into a better version of what we've got today, which is really in a very bad place. And I feel that in addition to learning what happens to the raw materials, the commodities, which become further degraded through ultra processing after they reach the food companies, we also need to forge a better understanding amongst the whole of the public about what happens before it leaves the farm. Because certainly from my experience, the chapter of agricultural history, which my farming experience spans, which is around 50 years, is a chapter where we've intensified and moved from a relatively producing food in harmony with nature system, which I can still remember as a child, to a system which is wholly extractive and damaging to climate, nature, and people. And I feel that the public are largely unaware of quite how much damage has been done, and they deserve and need to know more.
I think that's right. So there is this discussion of what we all believe our sort of theory of change is. And it's complicated because a lot of things have to happen together, or you need to pull a lot of levers at once. We need to change public understanding. In terms of changing public understanding about the health effects of products, that really requires regulation. It's very hard to modify the public's understanding of food at the moment because the packaging is so misleading, the advertising is so misleading, and because the messaging around food is so conflicted. You know, not just the vast majority, almost all of the information the public get about food, whether it's through the press or through the media or through entertainment, almost all of it is controlled by ultra processed food companies. And there's a little bit of government information, but a lot of that government information is also informed and lobbied by ultra processed food companies. So changing public opinion requires regulatory action that is impossible without changing public opinion. So you sort of, I feel, I speak to government, I try and speak directly to the public, and then my voice has become, I try and deploy it in a very particular way. I mean, there's there's a big community of people who speak very powerfully about what healthy food is. And I almost never speak about that. I very deliberately never tell anyone what to eat. My voice, the voice of someone like me, I think is best deployed critiquing power. And that I suppose I see as my project is this is an issue of fairness and justice where I do not, from a health point of view, I don't think anyone has an obligation to eat a healthy diet. And to a great extent, I don't care what people eat. There's a slightly different environmental perspective there. But from a health perspective, your health is your business. What I care about is that if you want to eat a healthy diet, which almost everyone actually does, you can afford it and it's available to you. And if you want to eat an unhealthy diet, you are appropriately taxed and there's a clear warning label on it. And at the moment, we have this appalling system where almost any food with a health claim is very likely to be actually unhealthy by any standard. And children and adults are saturated in marketing for food, not just obvious junk food, but for food that poses as health food, but is actually harmful, not simply because it's ultra processed, but because it's high in fat, salt, sugar, and energy, and lots of other things as well. So from a health dimension, for me, the issue is justice. And then that comes together with the environment. So the big bit of public communication where I think the ultra processed community need to build better bridges is with the agri-science and plant-based and environmental and climate change community, where in my opinion, ultra processed food is the nexus where all of these problems meet. And I'm interested in your perspective. I think you and I probably do see this the same. If you care about animal welfare, antibiotic resistance or usage, pesticide usage, land use, biodiversity, deforestation, plastic pollution, climate changing emissions, all of these problems come together with ultra processed food. That it is the primary driver of all of those issues. It's the secondary driver of climate changing emissions. And people say, oh, well, it's not all UPF, but it is all UPF, or it's the companies that make UPF. And yes, Nestle and Coca-Cola do make some products that don't meet the definition of ultra-processed food, but they are broadly speaking ultra-processed food companies, as are McDonald's, Burger King, all of the fast food retail chains, and the supermarkets are ultra-processed food companies. So I see UPF as the place where it all comes together, where I think there's a lot of academic discussion in the environmental movement that in some way ultra-processed food is the solution to climate change. And I think that is a serious misunderstanding. It misunderstands how power works and it misunderstands what ultra-processed food is, in my opinion.
Well, I think I agree with everything you said, but maybe there is a difference of emphasis between us. I mean, you started by talking about not prescribing what a healthy diet is. And I agree with you, if you can answer me on this. I don't see a healthy diet as being a certain set of foods eating in a certain proportion. I see a healthy diet could be anything from what, say, the nomadic pastoralists eat in northern Kenya, which is sort of blood, meat, and milk, or it could be, a plant-based diet and everything in between. I think what matters more is how the food was produced. And this phrase, "you are what you eat." Well, I think it goes beyond that. It's "you are what you ate," which is actually the title of a book by a man called Professor David Montgomery. And "you are what you eat" with the plant is obvious, but "you are what you ate" goes to animals as well, and it goes back to the soil. And so what I'm saying is that the fertility and the health of the soil is a vital determinant of the health and vitality and safety of all the foods that we eat, but even before they're ultra processed. And I think that bit has been forgotten. What do you think about that?
So this is where I want to be very nuanced, because you and I, in private, and I appreciate this podcast isn't private, but in private and in the confines of this podcast where I can speak in a more nuanced way, I agree with you. And I buy organic food and I feed my kids organic food for lots of reasons. Some of them I know the evidence about, some of them I don't, but I like to understand the provenance of my food. I like eating meat from animals that have been treated well. I think when it comes to the argumentation about this, if I were and I do advocate for organic farming practices, I think that should be the standard. I think it should be the way we produce all of our food should be organic standards and beyond. I suppose in making the argument, I soft pedal the health difference between an organically grown tomato, carrot, pint of milk versus a non-organic tomato, carrot, or pint of milk. Because I think that generating the evidence that there is a significant, measurable economic population health gain from doing that is going to be really hard. I probably believe it's there, but I think it's really hard to show over the long term. If we think of the experiment of randomizing a population or a group of people to an identical organic versus non-organic diet, I have a feeling the organic diet would be much healthier. And it would be healthier because it would have in lots of dimensions that weren't directly about the effect on the body, but about the effect on the planet and mental health. And so we see these wider changes. But it's also possible to theoretically argue that an ultra-processed or you could make an unhealthy organic diet versus a non-organic diet of whole foods that probably would be healthier. So I feel like organic farming should be the standard. I think the environmental and planetary health case and the indirect effects on human health is overwhelming. But I stop short of making that recommendation for population health, partly because the UK diet is so bad that worrying about whether if kids are so far from eating carrots, apples, drinking pints of milk, if we could shift kids from fizzy pop or non-nutritively sweetened, artificially coloured and flavoured soft drinks, if we could shift them onto any old milk, I would be, or water, I would be delighted. Does that make sense? But I'm always excited by the idea of anyone who could demonstrate a health benefit of organic food, because I would love to have that tool of argument. But I feel the environmental arguments are so strong, and that's where the alliance is. But I also agree with your argument that the organic food is nutritively superior. I think what's really hard is building the evidence from going, we can measure the difference between two carrots, and therefore we can be certain they will improve human health. I think that, and that's where in these arguments, because I have these arguments with industry, I'm very protective about how I extend scientific arguments, because the second I overstep the evidence, the goons from the food industry goons are on me.
Yes, I can see that. And also, you're a stickler for good science, and I massively respect that. And I'm glad you are. And I also recognize, and of course, I agree with you, that the environmental and climate benefits of producing food biologically and in harmony with nature are more or less accepted these days, although they weren't in the past. And there is still some debate about it. Let's call the damage done by our current farming systems, economists call them externalities, meaning not necessarily costed into the price of the food we buy. So modern intensive farming, extractive farming, is pretty bad for climate, and it's definitely bad for nature. If we were to
Yeah.
recognize that industrial farming is damaging to climate and damaging to nature, and we were to monetize that damage and put that on the price of, quote, conventional food, which everyone's mostly buying these days, then that would massively narrow the price
Yes.
gap between the, quote,
Yeah.
organic food that most people can't afford to buy, let's say that, and the normal food, which everybody is buying. But that's not going to happen. And I have a feeling, and I think you might agree with this, that faced with an economic downturn and wars and God knows what going on, and people being worried about the price of everything, and governments not willing to apply the polluter pays principle, so to put up the price of food, and that would be politically unpopular, then it's unlikely that we're going to get those taxes, those externalities properly attributed. And therefore, we've got this huge gap of price, which I think is a dishonest gap, really, between the sort of food that we're producing and the normal food that most everyone is eating. And I have a feeling, and I'd like to ask you this, don't you think that a more powerful driver of change is concern about health right now than concern about climate or nature? Because it's selfish, and we all don't want to die younger. And you'll know that it was in the news yesterday that healthy life expectancy is now dropping. So if it could be shown that, for instance, there are more cancers, food intolerances, conditions of the immune system, etc., which could be correlated with the way that food was produced, don't you think that's potentially a stronger driver of change than climate and nature right now?
So first of all, yes, you're right. And we massively invest in research to demonstrate these things. Part of me feels a bit uneasy going, I don't know why you have to prove that doing things in this way is healthier when the other arguments are so overwhelming. But we need to spend the money proving it. I think there's a plausibility argument that's very credible about effects on human health. I think in terms of those, in terms of the way I see the argument made, it would actually be very difficult to use organic ingredients. Is this true, to make ultra processed food, which the majority of which is necessarily built from ingredients that have to be grown with mass agrochemical inputs, commodity crops at scale. And there's a kind of
I'm not sure if I
incoherent.
agree. I'm not sure if I agree with you there. I think, I mean, let's take McDonald's. And a burger. So I don't know if you've seen it. It's a film called Food Inc. And the opening sequence is a chap called Eric Schlosser, who's an old friend of mine, eating a
Yeah.
burger. And he looks at the camera, he takes a bite on this burger and he says, I like a burger. And then he says, and he said, the trouble is though, the burger we're eating today has not a very good story behind it, which the food companies, he doesn't mention McDonald's, of course, behind them don't want you to know, because if you knew that story, you wouldn't want to eat it. And then the film goes on and it shows how extractive farming is causing damage, and there's 1,000 cows in every burger and all that kind of stuff. But I'm kind of with Eric. I like a burger. And I want to eat a burger with a good story behind it. And actually, I think McDonald's, certainly I know people at McDonald's who certainly privately and maybe even publicly would like their burger to have a better story behind it. But they're caught in a trap, aren't they, of price, because
Yeah.
they have to make their burgers affordable. And actually, in the UK, you may know this or you may not know this, all the beef in a UK McDonald's burger is actually just beef. It isn't even adulterated.
Mm.
Whereas I think there's a worse story about the BAPs and other ingredients. So they are sourcing organic milk these days. But an old friend of mine called Craig Sams, who was the founder of Whole Earth Foods and Green and Blacks and all sorts of things, he once said to me, we'll know we've succeeded if we get an organic Mars bar or something like that. And I'm not saying that the whole, I thought you'd like that, but I mean, I'm not saying we all ought to eat ultra processed food with organic ingredients necessarily, although I have to admit that I do have some weaknesses in this respect. But I think that it's really important that all the food we eat is produced in a system which is more likely to make it nutrient dense and free of pesticide residues. So I feel that's a universal proposition, which should apply even to the companies that are producing quite a lot of the fairly heavily processed food we're eating today. What do you think about that?
There are several things to deal with there. First of all, in terms of, can you make ultra processed food from organic ingredients? Yes, you can. And would, all other things being equal, is UPF made from organic ingredients better? I think yes, with a caveat I'll come to. I do suspect that if we could get to a position where there was a public mandate for bringing in much higher standards for food production, there's an incoherence between going, I want to eat organic and I want to eat Mars bars or McDonald's burgers or anything else. Now, what I'm not saying is no one like you or I both eat organic food. And we're quite a weird community of somewhat price insensitive people who really, really kind of care about food. And we're foodies and we're privileged in our ability to spend money on food. You and I both enjoy junk products occasionally, or ultra processed products occasionally. I do, my kids do. But in general, the food we go to is not, we haven't built the foundations of our diet from fast food chains, ready meals, and so on. We might
Correct.
have them occasionally. And so if there was an organic chocolate bar, yeah, we would probably go and get that one. But we'd still only be eating it every fortnight or less. And so I think generally people who care about organic food, it is somewhat incoherent to go, I'm going to care about animal welfare, animal husbandry, antibiotics, blah, 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 all the problems listed, and go, and then I'm going to go and shop from corporations that are primarily, their business model is chopping down tropical forest, growing cows at scale, intensive farming, antibiotic use, land use change, and plastic pollution. That's the model of all the big UPF companies, whether they're retail, fast food, or production. And so I think one of the things is, as you move the public toward caring about the origin of the food, I think you also necessarily move the public away from a candy bar with organic cane sugar, or a fizzy pop, the Coke with organic cane sugar. I think the minute you're concerned about organic cane sugar, are you actually drinking fizzy water, phosphoric acid, flavorings, colorings? Oh, and the sugar's organic. I think you've reached a threshold where you're probably not consuming that much of that. In terms of the McDonald's, I mean, I was thinking about the McDonald's example. We have a mutual friend that we've discussed this with. I think it would be brilliant for all of these big companies to be forced to procure all of their ingredients in an organic way. It'd be great for the planet. It would solve externalities. Blah blah blah.
Well, some anyway.
I'm. It concerns me when other people can do what they want. I don't want to give a single bit of credit to any big multinational food company doing all kinds of harm to human health and the planet for doing one small sliver of good that ultimately they are institutionally doing, I would say, for more or less cynical reasons. I'm not specifically talking about McDonald's here, but all of the big food companies can point to small things that they do, little tweaks to products. They sell a healthy dish, an organic that. But overall, if we step back, these companies really violently resist all forms of regulation, and they are part of a project to corrupt science and move the food system in a very harmful direction. Be great if it was just the standard, but I hate it when companies use regenerative farming, organic standards. I mean, organic, of course, is very different to regen standard, I suppose. But for any big company that overall does harm to the food system, to justice, to equity, to human health, and to planetary health, for them to go, oh, we're going to make this one little bit of our product, we're going to do that good, and then we're going to do a big publicity campaign about it. I get anxious because if a company like McDonald's does a thing like selling organic milk, is it good in the sense of if all other in the thought experiment, if all other variables remain the same, if I'm a scientist about it, and all that happens in the food system is McDonald's shifts their milk supply to organic, that is an unquestionably good thing. But that's not what happens. What happens is, all kinds of other things may happen. They may sell more burgers that are intensively farmed. They may just not actually sell that much milk, and they'll be selling more sugar in the fizzy pop. There are all kinds of unintentional consequences, and overall, I would raise that it may be problematic. I know that sounds I can be a real spoil sport about all this stuff. On the one hand, I'm cheering for the success of the organic community, like getting McDonald's to do this. And on the other hand, I'm going, I want this to be the standard. I don't want McDonald's to take credit for doing a thing that they just should be doing. And if McDonald's believe this is a good thing to do, why isn't all their meat organic? Why isn't all their wheat organic?
Well,
They've just picked milk because they don't sell much. I don't know. My lawyers aren't sitting with me, but if you really believe it.
Let me take you on, because I'm, I like you probably too much for this sort of antagonistic, polarized conversation. I'm trying deliberately to look for a difference between us. So here's where there may be difference between us. You are anti all these food companies, and you think they are the people that need to be sorted out before we get the food systems we deserve. I'm saying these big food companies, the McDonald's and the Nestle's, they're us, because we are buying their food and we're empowering them by buying their foods in the marketplace. And I think it's disempowering to blame them. I think the more empowering thing is to say that we determine the future of our food systems by what we buy. And I know there are arguments against that. We could say, well, they edit choice, and there are food deserts and you can't buy good food anywhere. But if we really changed and each of us exercised our individual buying power to buy better food, including from these big food companies, they would either change or they become Kodak. And I think that is kind of interesting, because I think there are large numbers of people, particularly actually very young people, like you just met my son James, and Gen Z, I think, are different from millennials. I think there are a lot of young people today who are pretty interested in this stuff, following your podcast, all that kind of stuff. And they are quite discerning and potentially a force of big change. And I think if that was manifested at sufficient scale, then the McDonald's and the Nestle's and the Unilevers, all these vast food companies who are slaves to giving people what they want, what they think they want, which is cheap food, would have to change. So my kind of core proposition is, let's mobilize that public force for change by giving the information that has been denied from them and empowering them to be the change we want to see. And then the companies will either have to change the products they offer or disappear.
I think you have found a point of real difference here that just comes from our perspectives. And it's not that do I think you're wrong? I think you kind of acknowledged as a caveat what I think is front and center, that the price structure, the the food companies aren't, they have a formulation. Henry Dimbleby, one of the only things I slightly disagree with Henry Dimbleby on, and Henry's a good friend, is this idea of a junk food cycle, that the companies sort of, we want junk food, they make junk food, we buy more, they make more. It's like this exchange. Nestle, the most extreme example is Nestle floating a barge full of candy and ice cream hundreds of kilometers up the Amazon to create a market in the interior of Brazil. And there was no one in the middle of Brazil, in the forest, indigenous communities going, you know what we need? We need some Kit Kat. No, we don't need public health services. We don't need dental. We don't need toothpaste. We certainly don't want any warnings on this Kit Kat. All we want is formula milk, Kit Kat, ice cream, whatever was on the barge. I shouldn't be too specific, but I did some reporting on this.
Yeah, I've read it. I've read
that.
It.
But that's the food companies are doing in the UK. When you say, oh, well, if people only knew, they would choose, it is completely unrealistic for anyone who isn't basically like me. And I really mean, like, in the top few percent of households by income, people who are really extraordinarily privileged, people have so little wiggle room between their rent, their energy. They are going to buy at a big supermarket. Everyone is price sensitive to food. And the reason the prices are the way they are is because the policies are set by industry. So it's not like these multinationals are very sensitive to consumer choice. They dictate consumer choice. They decide who's going to be in the supermarkets. And the government food policy committee is co-chaired by industry, by the Institute for Grocery Distribution. And then it's on the committee are multiple representatives of some of the biggest food companies. The academic research is funded by industry. The big food charities partner with industry. So there is such enormous power. And when government does say, we want to bring in this is happening right now. Government want to bring in an improved definition of unhealthy food. It's very boring. It's called the Nutrient Profile Model 2018. And it is an update on the 2003-2004 NPM, Nutrient Profile Model. It's just a better definition. It would shift Cocoa Pops from being healthy. At the moment, Cocoa Pops is a healthy food. It would redefine Cocoa Pops as an unhealthy food, which probably, and quite a lot of products like that. It's a very small change, tiny, tiny little change. And also, this has been in the pipeline now for 8 years. This proposal was developed 8 years ago, and government have just started a consultation, and industry are just fighting this tooth and nail. So from my perspective, I think, very small changes in the system. I want a few mandatory warning labels. I want to extend the sugar tax. I want some better marketing restrictions, changes in school food. This is low-hanging fruit. We have 25% of kids living with obesity on average at the age of 10 in the UK. So in my view, that the companies, they are not merely, they make the market, they create the information, they design the policy, they mark their homework, they set the rules. Their power is unbelievable. And I do frame them as they are trapped by the rules, but they're also creating the rules. Totally accept. They have no choice. I totally accept that I have loads of good friends in the food industry who would love it to be different, as you have friends at McDonald's, who I'm sure are lovely. I have friends in some of the biggest, baddest food corps, and they're all decent people. Emmanuel Faber at Danone wanted to change it as CEO, who's the head of the whole company, got fired by activist investors.
I know.
So they are stuck. They need the rules being changed. So my formulation is inform public opinion to create a mandate for regulatory change, because the food industry, I do not think there is a single instance of any food company doing something in the service of public or planetary health that was against their financial interests.
That's the point,
doubt there's a single example.
So I think we're not as far apart as I might have been.
Yeah,
because my question to you is, what's your theory? And I'm going to tell you what I think it is. What's your theory of change, or your intervention, which you hope will change this? And I think you are a perfect example. You are saying, challenge this, call it out, mobilize public opinion through your brilliant book and your other forms of communication, awaken the public to what's being done to us all, mobilize them, which puts political pressure on the government to regulate better and to change the law. And in the end, it is about informing people. And if they realize how bad...
I go much further than that, really, because that hasn't really worked. And what is starting to work is legal action. So we see in the States the first private lawsuit against the big companies, the Martinez case. It got thrown out of court, but it's on appeal and it may get through on appeal. We've seen the city attorney of San Francisco launch a statewide action against the big food companies. California's brought in really, really proper aggressive regulation.
I was just in California last week with Jen Newsom, who's actually leading a big food campaign, and went to Earth Day in Sacramento with her at a lunch where she's got all the universities to source regenerative food. So I agree with you.
Amazing.
So
I think we're going to see the lawsuits start to make it, they take away social license, because it's hard if you're doing procurement for British schools to be getting food from companies that the local government in Washington, D.C. has already had to sue for dereliction of duty. So I think my model is tobacco, and there's not one thing. It's like good science that's independent of industry, constant advocacy, make it a rights issue, build alliances, lobby the government. But we need massive amounts of money. And in the end, it was the lawyers who sorted out tobacco. The reason you and I aren't smoking on this podcast is because in 1998, there was a multi-state action. There was a settlement for 17 billion. And that's why regulations came in around the world. But even the lawyers find it's very hard for European law. It's very hard to sue companies in the UK. Very, very difficult. I don't think there was ever a successful settlement against a tobacco company for any reason in the UK or in Europe, ever. It was only in the US.
Let's suppose we agree on that as well, that in the end, legal challenges along with informing people about what's going on are all part of the corrective measures, if I can put it that way. But in the end, if public are totally ignorant as to what's going on, very little of that will happen. So I think your main channel of theory of change is through very, very effective communication. And I think there's a huge amount that connects us. And I'm going to go back to food companies because I object to be feeling disempowered by food companies. And I'll give you a story. This is a bit old now, but an ex-CEO of Tesco's, I had tea with him. This is back Terry Leahy, Sir Terry Leahy. He was the boss then. And I made an accusation to him. I said, your policies are putting small and medium-sized family farms out of business. And he said, well, what do you expect me to do? I'm between a rock and two hard places. The rock is my competitors who are driving down the price of food. It's only got worse since then with Aldi and Lidl and all that sort of thing. So I have to price match them. And the two hard places are my customers who want cheap food and my shareholders who will sack me unless I make more profit than I did last year. So I said to him, that's a really good answer. But if your core business is to give your customers what they want today, which is cheap food with a bad story behind it, with bad social consequences, my core business is to influence what your customers want tomorrow. And he said, fair play to you, because if you're successful, we're like a Pavlovian dog. We will follow. If you succeed in creating a market where people want better food, produced in harmony with nature, more nutrient density, blah, 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 we will follow because our core business is giving our customers what they want. Now, I think you're going to agree with that because in the end, it is a market. And I know the market's skewed and we could talk about true cost accounting and all the rest of it. But in the end, it is us. We're the powerful ones and we need to feel that.
Yes. I'm with you right up to going, people can vote with their wallets, because I think the real lived experience of a very big majority of people in this country is that they cannot. The only shop they can get to is a Tesco, a Sainsbury's, an Aldi or a Lidl. If they go to the delicatessen near my house, I bought a loaf of bread there yesterday. It was £7.70. The milk, I think, is more than £3 for a couple of pints. I mean, it's just, and it's all organic, lovely stuff.
Mind you, the producer's not getting that. I can tell you that as a dairy farmer.
I'm sure of that. And we get our milk delivered by a milkman, which I hope is a shorter supply chain. But I think Tesco's core business, I don't believe their core business is serving their customers' interests. Their core business is their shareholders. That is their business.
No, it's not sharing their customers. It's not their customers' interests. It's what their customers buy.
Sure. But the hierarchy goes owners, then the customers come secondary to the owners, in my experience. And so part of it is there are a lot of incredibly smart, skillful people who go, well, I'm stuck at this place being paid millions of pounds a year and there's nothing really I can do. So I just have to keep doing bad things. And I think that's an argument that's been used by people doing harm throughout history is, oh, well, if I didn't do this harm, someone else would be paid £1 million to do the harm. So I'll be paid £1 million to do the harm.
Well, just now, you said that the CEO of Nestle was sacked. Was it Nestle or was it Danone?
Danone, yeah.
But the same with Nestle, actually. The guy who was sacked very recently, the same thing. The share price is falling, so they booted him out.
I suppose my argument to those people is get sacked. There's an argument for the people on the shop floor. They can't lose their job. So there's a whole tier of people in a company. When you're in the C-suite and you're making what most people make in a decade or in their entire career, you're making that every year in options, get sacked. Like, there are people, you could go and work for all these food companies. There's a lot of senior executive complaining about how trapped they are while they are paid unimaginable sums of money for most people. And they don't have to go and do these jobs. They could go and do a job resisting it all. They could go and work for the regulator and not in a revolving doorway. They could go and help people like me. They could take some of their enormous sums of money and try and fix the problems. And there are all these regulators who include the charities, doctors, scientists, government, and they need complete independence from the corporations that need regulation. And it doesn't mean shutting them down. It doesn't mean calling them evil. But I think the place we've got to is because primarily the multinationals, but also all of the food companies working through things like the Food and Drink Federation, because there are now conflicts at all of those people who would create the level playing field that would internalize all those externalities that would bring about this regulation. The charities, the scientists, the doctors, the government, all of those entities have been captured by enormously powerful corporations. There is no possibility for escape without this sort of public movement. My instinct is to sort of go, oh, people should shop in a particular way and vote with your wallets. And the reason I never say it is I just know from my friends, my kids are at the local school, and I have patients who are from very low income settings. And I think it is so impossible for people to sort of vote with their wallets at the moment. But there needs to be another form of activism. And that's where I think organizations like Bite Back and UNICEF come in, and they're going to bring about this justice. It's a tangle here because I want to say a whole bunch of stuff that I'm the wrong person to say. I do hope people go and buy better food, and I do hope people go and buy organic. But I refuse to put any moral responsibility on anyone who to do it, and I won't shame anyone who can't or doesn't.
I think it's brilliant.
Make it
Yeah,
clear.
it's completely right. And I don't think anything you've said is at odds with where I'm coming from. I'm just in a different place in the ecosystem, but our outcome objectives, I think, are identical. So I guess what I feel passionate about is that there should be strong links between us, because what you are, the influence you're having in the sphere where you wish to be without overextending it, I get it totally.
You're the source of a lot of my thinking on this, Patrick. And I think we launched this Lancet series about ultra-processed food in November, where we really established scientifically that there is causality, that a diet of ultra-processed food causes health harms. It's not just food eaten by people who live with other forms of disadvantage. I hope we will do another series for the Lancet. And we did 3 papers this time, but it was very much focused on food and health and the political economy around that and policies and things. And I think where all of the scientists who study the health effects of the food, where we all want to extend our thinking and our research is into the effects on the environment and on human health in a more sort of multidimensional way, where we're looking at, if you make it with the pesticides, the recent Monsanto stuff has come out, the Bayer lawsuits and the ghost written papers. I think it's very clear the effects on human health extend far beyond what the molecules from the food do inside your body. One of the main problems is that one of the arguments of the ultra-processed food industry and food retailers is that they are responsible for food security. And yet what we've seen over 30 years is continuously rising food insecurity for reasons like cutting down tropical forests to grow crops like soy, but the forest makes the rain, and now we're getting drought in the places that we grow the soy. So we run out of soy that we've built the food system around. And these kind of effects, whether it's forest fires in Indonesia or droughts in middle and southern Brazil, those kind of effects are just going to get worse and worse and worse.
Yeah.
So
And
I think this is where
I'm
we want to take the work.
I'm a case study in food, from food security to food insecurity with our carrot story. I mean, carrots for supermarkets used to be produced by relatively small mixed farmers all over the UK, but for price reasons, the supermarkets decided there'd be a price advantage to having one pack house per vegetable type. In the case of carrots, it's just outside Peterborough that supply all the carrots for Waitrose and Sainsbury's. Or if you take lamb, to take an animal product, all the lambs for Sainsbury's are killed in an abattoir just 10 miles from us in Llanybother. And that specialization makes it impossible for, if you're a carrot grower, as I was back in 2006, to supply into the supermarket food chain. And that massively increases the food insecurity should there be sudden shocks, which is what Tim Lang's going on about. So the question there is how to reverse it. And that's extremely relevant to us. And we actually are, as you know, I think we're a case study in that, because we're part of a project called Welsh Veg in Schools, where the vegetables have to be grown in Wales. And so what we are trying to do here is rebuild a localized food system, which of course costs more. And there's the irony, isn't it? That if you want to have locally produced, sustainably produced food and make it available to school children, which is what, we're trying to do, it does actually cost more. And the question is, where's that money going to come from? Because I think that's another really interesting point.
It is so horrifying. And it speaks really to I am not a leftist politically. I sit within capitalism. I use capitalism. I work I work mainly for national institutions, but I am not anti-capitalism. But capitalism, there are many forms of capitalism. And one of the things we have that is kind of a founding principle is monopolies are bad and oligopolies are bad. And in the end, you have to interrupt corporate power. And that doesn't mean destroying all forms of corporate power. There's a way of framing this where I'm like anti-UPF companies. It's more like I'm pro a diversity of smaller organizations, of local food systems that will in the end be cheaper for all of us. Because when you say the externalities aren't priced in, it's not merely they're not priced in, it's not that it's more expensive in the end, it's unaffordable in the end. We are just going to destroy everything.
Until we destroy everything, it appears cheaper. That's the terrible irony.
You cannot partner with these companies to bring about change. They have to be resisted as an adversary if you want them to change the tiniest thing. If you want to move a box of crunchy nut cornflakes up one shelf, you're going to have to employ a bunch of lawyers and spend millions of pounds doing it.
But don't you think actually they have to be regulated, which is back to your point that government has to intervene? But the irony is that Keir Starmer, whoever political leader will have, it doesn't really matter which hue of government it is, they basically want to get re-elected. That's what drives politicians. And I think at the moment, the government rightly thinks that the issues we're discussing on this podcast now are not a vote winner. So if they say, look, we're going to break up these great monopolies, which are getting, larger and larger and making it possible for small carrot producers or whoever to survive, they don't think that's as powerful a driver as keeping food cheap. So unless we mobilize voters to say, well, to the government, unless you bring in regulation to stop these corporations getting ever bigger, then we won't vote for you. They're not going to change it. And that's why I think what you're doing is so powerful, because you're mobilizing normal people who eat cheap food at the moment to recognize that this should be a voting issue.
UPF is complex because your words are very quickly instrumentalized to sound like I want to make food more expensive. And what I really, really want is food to be cheaper for everyone. And I passionately believe that is possible, but it will require, a lot of this is political framing. If you frame it as we're anti-industry, you're toast, and in all kinds of ways.
Well, that's why
you can frame it in a million different ways. You frame it as just, we're going to take care of the health of kids and extending. People are basically quite enthusiastic about regulation of unhealthy food, but it does require politicians from both sides of the aisle to stand up and go, we're going to extend the sugar tax. The sugar tax is a really good thing, and we're going to extend it. It's going to include sweeteners, and we're going to extend it to sweeties. It is wild that we have a sugar tax on fizzy pop, but we don't have a sugar tax on literal pieces of sugar. And you don't have to tax sugar in domestic cooking. There are all kinds of ways of doing it. without driving up the price of the weekly shop? I'm sure there are. And you have hypothecated taxes. So you use that to drive down, you put up
Love
one
it.
bed of the basket and you drive it down. There's a laundry list of things you can do. The other thing you do is you put warning labels on stuff. And that we know that if you do my basic ask, which is so basic, is we should have South American style warning labels, octagonal stop signs for fat, salt, sugar, energy, and non-nutritive sweeteners.
So couldn't we also have positive labeling? So you have those warning labels, but we also have a trusted sustainability label. And notice, I'm not saying an organic label here, even though I'm an organic farmer, which tells people what they can do to be part of the solution.
I would love that. One of the rules about the labels is once something gets a warning label, a load of other things come into place. So you can't make a health claim on a food with a warning label. If a sugary breakfast cereal has a warning for sugar, it can't say it's high in fiber.
Yeah.
It can't say it's vitamin enriched. And the cartoon character comes off. So you negotiate around, I agree there should be way more environmental labeling on all of this. If your chicken's fed on Amazonian soy, that should be on the box.
Look.
But then you have taxes on the worst products. The cartoon characters come off. You can't sell them to kids. They're not supplied in institutions. There's a very well evidenced, from tobacco and from food industry regulation around the world, there's a very well evidenced path here to deal with all this. And none of it need drive up the price of food. You can even put the taxes to one side. If you take the cartoon character off the box, children stop asking for the food. It's pretty simple.
Well, look, hypothecation of taxes, I agree with you, although that's politically challenging. But look, you've been very generous with your time. But a couple of other points just before we finish, because I know you've got to go off. The couple of things I wanted to raise were, first of all, the role of livestock in sustainable food systems. I just thought I might ask you if you have an opinion about that, because I'll share a proposition with you. It will be difficult, not impossible. I would say impossible at scale to undertake a transition to truly regenerative farming and food systems which operate without an umbilical need for chemicals, without livestock being involved. What do you think about that?
That is what I understand. But Patrick, I got to say, a lot of my farming knowledge is from you and your friends. Eat meat I think people really like eating meat, and I believe it is possible to have a humane and sustainable form of meat production that kind of works. I think what drives this rise in meat production, meat consumption around the world is the ultra processing of the meat. We don't, that it's meat covered in flavorings. So that is my understanding of the science. What's really complicated is the big meat producers are so involved now in dietary guidelines, in the discussion, that it's very hard for the nuance of going, meat is not a monolith. There are many types of meat in terms of agrochemical inputs and feed and antibiotics and welfare and all the rest of it. But I think transitioning to a vegan system I think it feels a bit unrealistic for most communities. And so my view is we need meat, but very, very different meat. And ultimately, most of us in the UK and the US, realistically for the planet, we're going to need to eat a bit less meat, perhaps quite a lot less meat, but it needs to be way better meat, and we need to pay a bit more for it. And that needn't be any great hardship, and that should all be achievable, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that's absolutely right. And my view, which is to add to what you've just said, is we need to differentiate between the meat and the factory farming livestock systems, which are absolutely part of the problem, like in the Wyalusk and the prosecution that's currently going on for the pollution of all the rivers, etc. And the livestock systems which are truly welfare-friendly, regenerative, and part of the solution. And not only that, but those livestock systems will produce more nutritionally dense and flavoursome meat. So that was one point.
I was thinking while you were talking about this thing of going, and I know you and I agree about this thing of the anemic, intensively produced, whether it's meat, fruit, or veg, and how unpalatable it is. Aside from anything else, it doesn't taste all that good.
But that's great that you think that, and I think that's work to do to explain. But I think this is really important, because if you understand it, then millions of others will too, because a lot of people trust you, and I think rightly, just to call it out. Just another thing, while we're on livestock, I don't know if you ever listened to my podcast, but I did one on farmed salmon the other day, and I used to think because
I do listen to your podcast, but I have not listened to the episode on farm salmon, but I will because I think it's very interesting.
I was involved with the certification of organic salmon back in and I thought it was a good thing because I thought it'd be better that an organization that was cared about the public interest and better food investigated whether it was such a sustainable aquaculture with salmon was a possibility. And I retained that position and have been an occasional eater of farmed salmon ever since until about 2 months ago. And you'll hear or see if you listen to the podcast why I've changed my mind. I've changed my mind in a pretty radical way. I don't think there is any possibility to have sustainable open pen salmon farming. And as a result of what I saw and learned recently, I'm not going to eat it again. That's a pretty radical position to take. 'Cause you probably know that salmon is the UK's biggest food export.
Is it really? I need to know more about this. There's a load of stuff I want to express opinions about, and I have to remember.
Anyway, I just thought I'd call that out.
I have a lot of enemies who, when I say things casually, they come and complain at me. So
You'll hear why I've changed my mind. I had what I would call a seeing is believing experience of a negative nature at a salmon feed factory on the Isle of Skye very recently. Anyway,
what are the salmon fed? Is it quite a lot of soy?
there was a massive ship outside the salmon factory, which is visible from the Skye Bridge, offloading 1,000 tons of Argentinian wheat and genetically modified soy, which is the plant element of the salmon feed, which of course also has fish meal in it, which is sucked out of the oceans, whether it's mackerel or krill or whatever. I mean, the oceans are being asset stripped of all the food that we could eat, and instead it's being fed to farm salmon. There's also fish waste, but basically the feed sources are not only unsustainable, but because there is more and more plant food in them, that is altering the omega-3, omega-6 fatty acid ratio of the aforementioned salmon that we're all buying and eating. So there's a lot there, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, as you'll hear. With salmon, so many of us, including myself, have factored it in as a normal part of our diet for decades. And also, we live in a world where we don't know what can we eat. You know, it's a legitimate question. What can I possibly eat these days to be part of the solution? So I'm very sensitive to that. Just one last thing I want to share with you, and I think you're going to agree with this. And I sent you a clip of Hugh Fernley-Whittingstall saying the same. We've just launched a network of Beacon Farms, which is basically farms as educational platforms. And our aim is to get every child at primary school age to visit a farm which can give them a taste of what our food systems could be like, especially those in urban areas. And we hosted one on a farm in Dagenham, which happens to be run by my daughter, a couple of weeks ago.
I'm going to try and visit. We've got to find a date for it, but a visit. I'm keen to visit.
Well, I'm a Londoner who had a 5-minute experience in a dairy farm near Epping. Apparently there's only 4 dairy farms left in Essex now, I heard the other day. But anyway, I visited one in the 50s, and that's what got me back to the land and milking cows. And I think you cannot overestimate the potential of a seeing is believing experience to influence a young child.
I love that. I was thinking when you said you'd been farming for 50 years, humans there's a particular sort of form of farming that we've been doing for about 5,000 years, and you've been farming therefore for about 1% of the whole time that people have been doing a lot of farming. I mean, the earliest farming maybe 10,000 years ago, but you've been involved in perhaps an integer percentage of lots of the farming practices. So it's interesting how recent a phenomenon in our past farming is. But no, I heard what Hugh was saying, and I think there has to be push and pull. I definitely am more on the critical side and more on speaking to power, because I think that's the way a voice. I'm not in the business of. I'm not a chef. I'm not a cook. I'm not a nutritionist. I have a different medical specialty. I'm an expert in infectious diseases and global health. I don't tell people what to eat, but I'm cheering for all. I definitely want to support the voices who are, and I think I do think when you connect kids to what real food is, kids care. They want to eat good food. They're fascinated by it. Anyone with kids who can feed them good food knows that it's, in many cases, it's not a battle. Kids will eat broccoli. They like things. They're curious, and they love all these stories, and they love nature. They love farms. So I love what you're doing, and I must come and see it.
bring your children and give them an early seeing is believing experience on this farm or any other. We've got about 50 in the network now. So,
I love it.
Chris, look, you've got to get back to your next assignation. Maybe it's a medical one. Thank you so much. I've loved speaking with you. I'm a massive fan, as you know, and more power to your elbow. And I hope that our paths continue to cross.
They will, Patrick. You're an ally. Anyway, everything you just said, right back at you. And thanks so much for having me on. And we will speak soon. I'm going to see you. I'm going to see you at Groundswell probably. So
yes, if not before.
I'm
wonderful.
All right, loads of love.
Thank you.